Fire Emblem Class Warfare by Carmel Rechnitzer. Part 0. What are we talking about? Fire Emblem Three Houses is a great video game published in 2019. It's set in a medieval fantasy world and spends a lot of its playtime chatting about politics, pain, and power. I love the game, but think its politics are a bit messy. It asks questions like, do the ends justify the means? Is it morally just to kill your oppressors? What does a successful overthrow of authority look like? I wanted to talk about the confusing answers this game gives, so let's chit-chat. The first half of the game takes place at Garreg Mach Monastery. This monastery is the headquarters for two organizations, the Church of Seiros and the Officers' Academy. At the behest of the church, you become an instructor for the academy and help train ambitious youths to become the leadership of tomorrow. It's adorable. You basically roleplay a Hogwarts professor. You pick one of three houses, Black Eagles, Blue Lions, or Golden Deer, and personally watch over and teach your favorite students all about magic, leadership, growing up, swords, axes, self-esteem, spears, overcoming childhood trauma, punching, fishing, gardening, falling in love, and how to ruthlessly suppress threats to the church's authority. In the meantime, you'll develop strong bonds with all of your students, and maybe even take a shine to the students of rival houses. Everyone in this cast is adorable, and you'll spend 20 to 30 hours getting to know the intimate details of their lives, their loves, their past. Then, in the second half, the game kicks your shins out from under you when all your students grow up and go to war over ideological differences. You'll meet them again as the skilled and ruthless warriors you trained them to be, and lead them in battle to kill their former classmates. A lot of dark or mature media talks about how awful war is. That's not you, that's par for the course. Fire Emblem Three Houses stands out to me by making the conflict as personal as possible. When you kill adult Annette, you remember her as the overachieving dork who always tried her best despite her timid nature. When you kill adult Claude, you remember him as the charming prankster he once was, not the cunning fox who almost wrecked your entire battle plan. This little anime school simulator made me feel things. But not just about war, it also made me feel things about class. Part 1. So what does class mean in Fire Emblem Three Houses? I'm not going to rehash FETH's war is bad message. The game delivers on that theme competently all on its own. I'm going to talk about one of the more muddled and complicated aspects of the game, class. In previous entries in the Fire Emblem series, the word class was used to describe what kind of fighter each character was. A sword-wielding champion was categorized as being part of the hero class. An armored frontline fighter was a knight. A spell-slinging sorcerer was a mage. As well as using the word class to mean what this character is good at, FETH strikes new ground by talking about the socioeconomic status of each of the students, describing in detail where they fit into the hierarchy of their fantasy world, and uses the word class in the real-world sense. I'm not kidding. Before being assigned a proper combat class by you, the professor, each student is either a noble or a commoner. In this tactical war game, before your units are anything else, before they are fighters, knights, or mages, they are noble or they are common. The hard-coded rules of the game are in tune with the fiction of the FETH universe. Your socioeconomic background matters. It defines who and what your students are, how the game and the fiction treats them. Because this element is a primary mechanical and fictional component of every one of your students, I think it's safe to say the game wants you to think about class structure as you play. Part 1a. So, what's this class structure actually like? The class structure of FETH's fictional universe is modeled after medieval Europe's Three Estates model. Here's a quick rundown for those in the audience who need a refresher. The Three Estates were the broad categories of the social ladder of pre-modern Christian Europe. The topmost rung, called the First Estate, was that of the clergy. The Catholic Church transcended borders, and the authority of the Pope was recognized, though sometimes ignored, all over Western Europe. The second rung/estate was the nobility. Nobles drew their powers from the state they were a part of. A French noble might garner a high respect in a Spanish court, but he had no authority there, hence a little less powerful than the church. And lastly, the overwhelming majority of the European population was of the third estate. Serfs, laborers, artisans, and merchants. These guys did most of the work, paid most of the taxes, and had zero political power, living under the orders of the first and second estate. Each European country drew these boundaries somewhat differently. Church leaders and nobility tended to be related, appoint each other to office, and violently enforce each other's power. At other times, the First and Second Estates didn't get along at all. The English rejected the Pope, the Italians kept fighting over who got to be Pope, and some long-winded German guy called Martin Luther wrote some fiery Yelp reviews that broke the church in half. It's complicated, and individuals frequently moved back and forth between the First and Second Estates. But one thing was certain. If you were born into the Third Estate, you were dispensable, unimportant, and politically powerless. No crossing estate borders for you. It would take centuries of war, plague, careful maneuvering, greed, ingenuity, and a whole lot of guillotines before the system broke down and upwards mobility became a realistic possibility for any but a fortunate few. You stayed where you were born. So that's the super boring history of the real planet. How does that relate to the super cool history of the fake Fire Emblem planet? Well, it's set up about the same. Your characters are working for the Church of Seiros. It's run by a magic pope who casts spells and burns heretics without blinking an eye. Its authority is recognized by every country around, and folks generally worship and believe everything that angry magic pope has to say. The one difference, the Catholic Church is still averse to women in leadership to this day. The Church of Seiros is an equal opportunity employer, so this angry magic pope is a lady. Angry Magic Pope has so much authority that every country sends their best and brightest students to her crash pad to learn how to be statesmen and generals. The students are divided into 3 houses according to which country they came from. The houses compete against each other, Harry Potter style. But the Second Estate also leverages its power within the framework of the church. Each house has a student leader, a hall monitor who gets to boss others around. And coincidentally, each house is led by the prince or princess of their home country. The Black Eagles are led by Princess Edelgard, the character I'm doodling in this video. The Blue Lions are led by Prince Dimitri, and the Golden Deer, which is the undisputed best house of all and I'll fisticuff anyone who says otherwise, is led by heir apparent Claude. Hence, the best and brightest of the common folk find themselves trapped in a class structure where birthright and divine authority trumps their talent. Too bad, so sad, kiddos. You weren't born to the right parent, you don't get to be the main character. Part 1b. Doubling down. FETH. You know what, folks? This acronym is awkward. I'm calling it FETH. Gretchen and I are going to make FETH happen. Ahem. FETH goes another step to reinforce the status of the common folk as lesser. Each noble family in this universe has something called a crest. This is basically a magic, heritable birthmark that makes you better than others. Within the game's fiction, having crests is what justifies the power, office, and superiority of the nobility. Within the game's rules, the crests also offer a tangible advantage to the students who have them. They get special abilities, access to special weapons, slightly better stats. Further, the royalty who bear the most important crests, Edelgard, Dimitri, and Claude, function as the de facto main characters for the game. Each branch of the story revolves around following one of their character arcs. They were the focus of the game's marketing campaign. Their faces are literally on the box when you buy it. So, yeah, FETH, at face value, creates a clear hierarchy decided at birth. It builds a clear class ladder and places each student on the appropriate rung. And even that metaphor falls short. You can climb a ladder. Your students can't move up or down. They are stuck in their class position for the duration of gameplay. Part 2. The Ideal Noble. So, this hierarchy exists, and everything in the game so far indicates that it's God-given, true, and that common folk should just go home and cry. Nobles are actually better in FETH. That's that. And because they are inherently better, they should be in charge. Or rather, they are currently in charge because they are fundamentally better. It's a nice closed logic circle. And with this nobility comes power, and with power comes responsibility, right, Spider-Man? There are 2 students who spend much of their in-game dialogue chit-chatting about what kind of behavior a responsible noble should exhibit. Part 2a. Ferdinand and Lorenz. Ferdinand is competitive, hardworking, and excited to inherit Daddy's position of Prime Minister. He spends his time at school trying to be the very best in preparation for the role that will automatically pass to him. He frequently comments on how nobles should be well-groomed, well-spoken, well-mannered. He expresses a firm belief in justice. He's the exemplary noble son. He also struggles to overcome his privileged point of view, and struggles to understand why common-born students are hostile to him. When your professor chit-chats with him, he'll sometimes say, "You treat everyone the same, regardless of status. Perhaps I should do that as well." He's growing into the sort of upstanding noble who's polite about being better than you. Next is Lorenz. Lorenz takes an immense amount of pride in his noble birth. He inadvertently comes across as snooty, snobby, and pretentious. His haircut doesn't help. He brags about his fine breeding and inborn grace. And yet, despite talking like the prep kid dunce in every 80s high school drama, he's one of the most charitable and helpful characters in the cast. He doesn't shy away from going above and beyond at every imaginable instance. He'll give a hand to anyone and won't refuse to assist those born to a lower station. His conversations with Catherine really illustrate his understanding of the class divide. He says, "But the nobility and the common folk are different. If the few did not have the capabilities that set them apart from the many, then they would not be the few." He does, however, strongly believe that his privilege comes with a firm responsibility. Of course, such influence must be wielded with discretion. It is the noble's duty to use the power wisely. He even admits that when nobles misbehave, it is understandable for the common folk to revolt. Both Lorenz and Ferdinand exist to show the nobility at its best and, well, noblest. With such paragons of grace as these, and the game mechanically and fictionally supporting their superiority, it's clear that in this fantasy world, nobles deserve to rule, right? Well, no. Part 2b. Sorry. Both of these characters, who earnestly believe in nobility as an inborn virtue, are often treated as the butt of the joke. Ferdinand is so oblivious that insults and jokes at his expense go right over his head. His attitude also hampers his romantic prospects with common-born Dorothea. If he pursues the romance, he has to apologize and reassess his ego and class status before Dorothea accepts him. Lorenz, meanwhile, sounds like a parody character from an Oscar Wilde comedy of manners. Eventually, he also grows up and makes such apologies. To your professor, he says, "Now I know that bloodline alone is not sufficient to gauge a person's worth. I've learned much of this from you." To Leone, a common-born mercenary, he says, "By insisting on matters of status in dealing with you, I have done you a terrible disservice. For that, please accept my apology." Part 2c. Unlike father, unlike son. And there's a further element to the game that works to undermine the value of nobility within Feth. Both Ferdinand and Lorenz strongly dislike how their fathers have used their inherited offices. Ferdinand's father is by far the worst. His name is Ludwig, and he used his power as prime minister to lead an insurrection of nobles against the emperor of Adrestia. Ludwig and his co-conspirators stripped their emperor's powers and distributed these powers amongst themselves. Instead of using his newfound political sway to better the realm, Ludwig enriched himself and ruled as the puppet master from behind the throne. During this time, he worked closely with a cult that conducted inhumane experiments on human subjects. Hand in hand with his cult friends, Ludwig committed acts of violence and corruption against the citizens of the empire. He even gets off easy, initially facing a minor punishment of house arrest in his own castle. But unwilling to give up power, he tries to escape. Shortly after, he winds up murdered by a mob of vigilante peasants seeking revenge for his crimes. Lorenz's father thankfully doesn't have the same rap sheet. However, he is politically inept and has no strong sense of moral grounding or loyalty. Lorenz regards his father and the entire political apparatus of his home country as disdainful. His philosophy and flamboyant behavior are an attempt to overcorrect for the gracelessness and carelessness of the current nobility. Ferdinand and Lorenz seek to be paragons of chivalry. Both speak as though grace is inborn, as if nobility and responsibility come hand in hand. But their context and their background make it clear that despite what they believe nobles should be, that's not what nobles are actually like. So, wait a minute. If this is what the game's text represents as the best case scenario for a noble family, what are the middling cases and the worst cases like? Part 3. Suffering within the system. Almost every single student's personal history presents a dark view of noble political power. Here are some of the more straightforward examples. Petra belongs to a minor nation called Brigid. Her home country was crushed by Edelgard's empire and forced into vassalage, simply because Brigid was a geographically convenient stepping stone to the location the empire actually wanted to invade. Brigid got Belgiumed hard. Petra's father was killed in battle, and she is enrolled at the Officers' Academy as a political hostage. She's put into the Black Eagle's house and encouraged to play nice with the children of the lords who murdered her father and annexed her throne. Raphael's parents were murdered by bandits, leaving him orphaned and in charge of his younger sister. As the plot of the game progresses, it becomes clear that banditry is distressingly common in this world. Several other characters speak as to how prevalent of an issue it is, and how the nobility is not politically organized enough to ensure the safety of their peasants. Bernadetta is a traumatized recluse so overcome with fear that she struggles to leave her room or hold a conversation. This trauma is caused by her father, Lord Varley. Varley attempted to groom her to be the perfect wife to a politically beneficial match. He frequently tied her to a chair and demanded that she sit quietly and demurely for hours at a time. This abuse is an open secret. Everyone who talks to Bernadetta knows, but Lord Varley is never reprimanded or punished due to his noble status. Dorothea and her mother were cast out from their household when she was born without the noble crest that was expected of her. She only managed to escape the streets by pure luck. She describes her experience as an urchin as follows. Then the right person overheard me singing, and suddenly I was in the opera. I was a songstress, and my goodness did the nobles like me. The people who used to spit on me and call me an urchin, they praised my voice and my beauty. A nobleman who had once kicked me gave me the most gorgeous pair of shoes. I almost asked if it was a joke. Dudu showcases the worst of noble negligence. He is the survivor of intense racial conflict. His people, the Dusker, were falsely blamed for a crime they did not commit. As a result, the Dusker were massacred. Those who survived faced repeated pogroms. The nobility in power chose not to protect the Dusker or even investigate whether they were to blame in the first place. Even within the walls of Garreg Mach, and aided by his friendship with Prince Dimitri, he faces racist vitriol and hate from other students. Part 3a. So, what's the system good for? So now we arrive at the core contradiction inherent to Fath's text. Here the Pope is truly divine. The nobles really have a rare and magic bloodline. In this world, the justification for their power structure exists. However, this political hierarchy creates endless misery. Not only do the first and second estates fail to protect the lower class, they actively harm and suppress it. The more you see of Fath's world, the more you see the individuals suffering from systemic failure. The institutions in power constantly start wars and commit genocidal violence. They fail to address crime. They create poverty. They discriminate. They oppress. If this is where Fath's commentary on class ended, I'd consider it an interesting message. Hierarchies, even if justifiable on a surface level, create infinite opportunities for abuse. Just by placing people on top, you push undeserving people downwards into pain and suffering. You pop the sweet, flame decaled hood on a hierarchy, and you see the engines of oppression just chug-a-lugging along. That's the kind of anarchist messaging I can get behind. But here's the dealio. So far I've only discussed the setting of Fath, and the personal relationships of its cast. I haven't really talked about the plot, or what happens after the plot, which is really what muddies the messaging quite a bit. So, let's forge onwards. Part 4. The plot, with the least amount of spoilers I can manage. Like the title for this section says, I'll be doing a lot of glossing over the plot. Some nuance might be lost here, but I'd rather let new people approach this game with almost fresh eyes. I've provided some spoilers before, I don't think any of them matter to the actual gameplay, and I'm going to try to keep that attitude here. So, onwards we go. Regardless of which faction you choose to side with at the start of the game, the second wartime phase of the narrative starts due to the same inciting incidents. Edelgard, soon to be Empress of Adrestia, believes that the Church of Seros is an oppressive and unjust power, mostly because the Church does suppress and kill dissidents mercilessly. She wants to abolish the Church. She also dislikes the Second Estate, who empower the Church, since the Church's crest mythology justifies their noble status. Hence, she wants to abolish the crest system. So, part 2 of this game comes along because Edelgard, believing her ends justify her means, starts a continent-spanning war to abolish the Church and the noble crests. Thousands of deaths, sacrifices, and war crimes ensue. Bad times all around. Depending on the player's choice in Part 1, they can side with Edelgard, Dimitri, Claude, or the Pope. The war plays out differently from here. I won't describe how. Part 4a. So what's there to talk about if not the war? There's a ton of arguing online about whether Edelgard is a hero or a villain. Months after the game's release, discussion boards were still full of fans fighting over her actions and her motives. The first and second estate cause misery and destruction. Is it just for Edelgard to cause misery and destruction to dismantle them in return? Is she right, or is she a hypocrite? This argument is heated. On February 4th, lack of interest, a moderator for the Fire Emblem subreddit, stepped down, mostly due to time constraints. But they also described that they are tired of wasting their time deleting the personal insults, threats, bad language, and bullshit that anonymous posters would sling while talking about Edelgard. To quote, "The point is, I've wasted more time throwing myself into the series over the last 5 years than, I would hope, most fans of things would do in a period twice as long. As much as anyone here, I fully understand the value of celebrating and defending the things you love. So when a massive Fire Emblem loser like myself tells you that the amount of time many of you have devoted to arguing over Edelgard von Herstvelg is completely, absolutely insane, hopefully you can appreciate the scale of what I'm talking about. And because I can't heed words of advice, I'm here on the internet to throw what I believe is a unique and new kind of fuel onto that same old fire. I'm not going to argue that Edelgard was wrong. I'm not going to argue that the church was wrong. I'm not even going to argue that every faction was its own kind of wrong. I'm going to argue that the way most fantasy media frames the discussion of morality and heroism is wrong. That's right, baby. Metacriticism. Part 5. The way most fantasy media frames the discussion of morality and heroism is wrong. This section is a bit tricky. Stick with me for a moment as I thread the needle of our upcoming topic. I think it's safe to presume that since I told you that there's a war going on and that the player can choose one of 4 sides to join, you've already deduced that the game has 4 multiple endings. You'll have figured out that there is an ending where Edelgard wins and 3 where she loses. I'll not be divulging the details of how you reach those endings. But the rest of this video will cover what happens after those endings. See, after you beat the game, the end credits give you a heartwarming paragraph about how each of your students' lives continues after the war. You hear about who they married, how cute their kids are, what jobs they took on, what hobbies they developed. That's what I'm going to ruin for you, for the sake of the discussion. The sweet frosting that goes on the victory cake after the gameplay is over. I hope that's cool. Part 5a. No happy endings. Here's my problem with how all Theth's epilogues go. There is no ending where the second estate is destroyed. The aristocracy survives as an institution in every conceivable ending of the game. For example, let's revisit Ferdinand from part 2 of this video. If Ferdinand is not killed during the gameplay, he will always inherit his father's lands. Assuming I counted it right, Ferdinand has 22 possible epilogue slides. He becomes the new Duke of Aegir in each and every single one. If the Adrestian Empire survives, he also inherits his corrupt father's office of Prime Minister. The solution to Evil Duke is just, well, his son is nicer. Other nobles like Bernadetta renounced their inherited seat in a few of their endings. Some common-born characters can marry into the nobility. In fact, your professor can even ascend to the throne themselves if you play your cards right. In no ending, however, is the nobility abolished. Even Edelgard's victorious endings leave the nobility mostly intact. Edelgard keeps her throne and her power as emperor in every single one of her epilogues. She institutes reforms using her singular unchecked power. Most, if not all, of her noble buddies inherit their parents' lands and their parents' political office. In the base version of the game, the only positive change the player actually sees is Edelgard's promise to pass her torch to a hand-picked, benevolent successor instead of a child heir. It's unclear if any of her other compatriots promised to do so. The text implies that she'd force them to. Part 5b. A single ray of something adjacent to hope. It seems that complaints about the hollowness of these endings reached the developers' ears, because there was an attempted fix added to the game later after release. If you purchased the Cindered Shadows expansion for $25, and replayed Edelgard's storyline, and recruited the expansion-exclusive student Constance to your side, and have her develop a strong bond with Edelgard, you'll see the following exchange of dialogue. Constance. You work towards a future with no place for the noble houses of old. Granted, in your unified continent, the acting lord of each territory will come from noble stock, but in the long term, your system will replace the nobility. Our role will change significantly. Edelgard. That's exactly right. There will no longer be lords who inherently rule over a particular territory. Instead, nobles will act as government officials working for the people in exchange for a salary. Officials will be selected from the general populace as well, bringing an end to the very concept of social standing. All will rise and fall by their own merits. So, yeah, that's right. Edelgard set a continent ablaze, went to war, killed her former classmates, destroyed the church, all so she could maintain her personal throne and enact slow-moving, gradual change. That's her revolution. Her plan to smash the nobility is to A. take over the world, B. appoint a noble-born lord to every territory, and then C. eventually hand lordly power down to hand-picked peasants. Additionally, if Edelgard and Constance develop a singularly strong friendship, the game presents you with a shared epilogue for the two of them. This single paragraph implies what this transition of power under Edelgard's reign would eventually look like. Their ending slide begins as follows. For her service in the war and her innovations in magic, Constance von Nouvelle was among the first to receive peerage from Emperor Edelgard. Though her noble house was given no guarantee of power on a hereditary basis, Constance made certain that House Nouvelle would be relied upon in helping to achieve Edelgard's vision of a new social order. Edelgard's plan to abolish the very concept of social standing, apparently, is to raise personal friends who performed exemplary service to her government to peerage. The anti-noble empress actually explicitly expands the nobility, with the text implying that this wasn't a singular action on Constance's behalf. And perhaps this is me being far more cynical than the game and reading too much into it, but maintaining a system of peerage that has no hereditary basis isn't really that much of a step forward. It sounds nice, but it also sounds like each successive generation of hopeful leaders willing to sycophantically serve the new emperor or risk losing political power. To me, this doesn't sound like empowering the people. This actually simply empowers a singular authoritative emperor to hand-choose who their peers are. You have to pay extra money and jump through some very, very explicit hoops to see a glimmer of what Edelgard's reforms look like. And if you ask me, they're half-assed measures that only dismantle half of the noble problem. The hereditary basis goes. The unchecked, easy-to-abuse position of power remains. What little hopeful, idealistic storytelling the game has to present is hidden away and, personally, very unsatisfactory. And that leaves me asking one question. Part 5C. Fire Emblem, baby, what are you doing? This game's fiction spends all of its emotional and personal notes on saying loud and clear the Second Estate is a bad thing that hurts people. But here we are with every ending the game can offer, perpetuating the system that degraded, impoverished, hurt, and killed your favorite students. No matter what choices you make, the game will end with someone on a throne. With the vague promise that some faraway day and some convoluted how, Fire Emblem's world will eventually be better for the common folk. Theft isn't the only story that falls face first into this problem. If you're one of the fans of HBO's Game of Thrones, I bet you remember how much that ending stung. The show spares no gritty detail in showing you the systemic failure that nobility leads to. The dragon even melted the Iron Throne for the sake of symbolism. And the happy ending we somehow got was a council of nobles electing a wizard they've never met to be king because Tyrion promised them he would be very, very good at it. You can say, well, that's not a happy ending, and not every ending needs to be happy. And I agree with you, some endings should be somber, miserable, or horrifying. But let's not kid ourselves, the ending of GOT had jokes, inspirational music, bright lighting, smiles, and hugs. It was framed as a positive ending. Feth does the same thing. And I think I'm not far off the mark by saying that a whole lot of fantasy stories end this way too. Bad king deposed, good king on the throne instead. No dismantling the tools that tyrants use to cause misery. We all just pretend that the good king's successor won't, surprise twist, end up a tyrant in the sequel. As the saying goes, the king is dead, long live the evil vizier. Part 5C. And I think we both know why this is happening. I think it's really not that much of a mystery as to how so many fantasy stories end up stuck in this conundrum. A. No sane person thinks that birthright political power is a good thing. B. Fantasy authors generally work within the framework of the semi-familiar, borrowing from history or using common tropes, so the reader doesn't feel too lost in a new and unfamiliar world. So authors are trapped. Noble hierarchies are a staple of fantasy storytelling. They add realism and historicity. Readers may not suspend their disbelief for ye olde democracy, TM. But authors can't crib this familiar social structure uncritically. Having all nobles be good and pure hasn't worked since Robin Hood first crossed swords or arrows with the Sheriff of Nottingham. Heroes need an evil empire to fight against. But that's left us stuck in a rut. Authors like Joe Abercrombie, George Martin, Glenn Cook, and Scott Lynch have figured out how to tell dark and gritty stories of people struggling under or against noble systems. Authors like Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and Robert Jordan have told wonderful stories about benevolent princes fixing the system. And that's okay too. I want to be clear, it's great to let the good prince ascend the throne once in a while. But I found it much harder to find fantasy stories that both A, criticize the nobility as a system of government, and B, portray a happy ending where the system is genuinely overthrown. Not a whole lot of fantasy shows us what a true revolution would look like, what true justice would look like. That's why I'm arguing that the way traditional fantasy media frames discussion of morality and heroism is wrong. Because most fantasy media needs to criticize noble power structure to be honest, but can't overthrow the nobility without breaking aesthetic convention. For a character to be a hero and depose the nobility, they have to exit the aesthetic frame. Edelgard can't be both a princess and a revolutionary. Part 6. So, you say you want a revolution? Well, yeah. I'd like to see that. I'd like to see the braver, much more surprising version of Fire Emblem Three Houses, a version where the central theme of the class is followed to a logical conclusion, the one where the common-born students overthrow Dimitri, Claude, Edelgard, and the Pope all at once, where they don't just kill the bad guys in charge, they kill the system. Give me the story where my precious students get their revenge, where both estates are smashed. Give me the story where they build a better world. Give me the game where my students are true heroes and build a more just and equitable society now, not tomorrow. Give me a real happy ending. Give me Fire Emblem class warfare. And I want to be clear, I don't think every single fantasy book from now until forever should be about magical communist uprisings, though that sounds really cool and someone should write it. I'm just on the lookout for a few stories, a new set of fantasy tools and tropes where the good guys win and do something a bit more daring than coronate the nicest member of their squad. If you have any recommendations for this kind of media, I'd love to hear them. I'm sure I'm not the first person to think or feel this way. I ultimately consume about 60 fantasy books, shows, comics, or games a year, which is a nice big number that means I've encountered about 1% of the totality of fantasy fiction. There's a sea of amazing, great stuff out there that I've probably never even heard of. Please, tell me all about it. And if you want my recommendation for books that come close, check out Louise McMaster Bujold. She's a 4-time Hugo Best Novel Award winner and a favorite author of mine. Her Verkosigan Saga is a science fiction series, but it follows the journey of a medieval planet slowly becoming more and more forward-thinking, progressive, and democratic as it encounters intergalactic civilization. It's not exactly what I described above. The main character, Miles, is born into the landed gentry and unfortunately never loses this privilege. But it's wonderful to watch his efforts to better society come to consistent fruition. And it's a bit of a mean recommendation for me. This series is currently 16 books long, and the progress is gradual. You watch Miles grow old and his planet grow up alongside him, book by book. It's beautiful, but it's very time-consuming. I'm sorry, and you're welcome. If you're lucky like I am, you'll be able to borrow the ebooks or audiobooks directly to your phone or tablet through your public library. Check their website. That's how I encountered all 16 of these. Or if you want something short and sweet, I write and produce my own fantasy short stories. I hired local actors to perform them and put them on this YouTube channel for you to check out. A new short story will be coming out once a month, and I'll be making more of these video essays as often as I can alongside that. You can also check out my previous essay about the Witcher saga and its central feminist theme. If any of that sounds good to you, please like, share, and subscribe, and please comment on this video. I'm excited to get into the Edelgard Flame War, and I'm stuck in quarantine with nothing to do. I promise I'll answer. Part 7. So, is this goodbye? Just for now. See you next time.